Hi everyone, before we get started, please make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. You can also leave a comment with your location and the time you're watching, so YouTube will continue to offer you tales like this one. I learned a lot about long, empty roads and the kind of darkness that engulfs everything outside your headlights while working as an EMT in rural Montana. I was 28 years old that summer, and after 3 years on the job, I partnered with a man named Tom, who had been doing this for almost 20 years. Together, we covered a vast area hundreds of miles away. On a good night, the closest backup may be 40 minutes distant over the square miles of roadway that connected little communities where everyone knew one another. That July evening in 2019, we had just concluded what Tom termed a milk run, which consisted of 12 hours of short calls that weren't very serious. Around 2 a.m., we were returning to base when we saw a child who had fractured his arm after falling off his bike, an old woman who had chest symptoms that turned out to be indigestion, and a fender bender who was unharmed. We're both struggling to be vigilant. Tom was driving while I completed the last of our paperwork. After the exhilarating shift, the stretch of Highway 287 between Townsend and Helena is as barren as it gets. There are no houses or street lights 4 miles, only sagebrush and the occasional deer crossing sign. The lights on the ambulance's dashboard provided a little window of light in the pitch-black darkness. We had driven this route hundreds of times and were familiar with all of its turns and dips. A classic rock station on the radio kept us awake. When we saw the car up ahead, perhaps a quarter mile away, the engine hummed steadily, and I could hear Tom humming along to Hotel California while tapping his fingers on the steering wheel in time. I remember thinking how calm everything seemed, how different from the chaos we usually dealt with. A dark blue sedan, one of those generic models you see everywhere but never really notice, was illuminated by our headlights as we approached. The hood was propped open, and wisps of what appeared to be smoke or steam drifted up into the beam of our lights. The hazard lights blinked steadily, producing orange pulses against the black night. There was an unwritten rule on these remote roads: when someone needed aid, you stopped. We had witnessed this breakdown scenario dozens of times before Tom began to slow down without even talking about it. Despite the warm night, a man in his mid-30s was standing next to the car, wearing jeans and a faded denim jacket. He had his back to us as we approached, apparently preoccupied with whatever was going on under the hood. This showed that civility extended beyond medical emergencies, when you were frequently the only car someone might see for hours. Tom pulled the ambulance onto the shoulder, about 20 feet behind the sedan, leaving our emergency lights on, and the first thing that struck me was how still he was. Most people with car trouble pace around checking their phones, looking anxious or frustrated. This guy just stood there, one hand resting on the raised hood, completely motionless. Alert any additional traffic that might be approaching. The revolving red and white lights created odd shadows on the asphalt and the nearby brush, giving the impression that everything was moving even though it wasn't. I took a flashlight from the console and we both got out. The abrupt silence that followed the engine's death was nearly deafening. As we approached the automobile, our boots crunching on the rough gravel along the shoulder, Tom cried out, "Hey there, need some help?" The man didn't turn around after hours of road noise. His face was unremarkable, with a stubbled jaw and dark hair that needed a cut. But when he finally turned to face us, it was this slow, deliberate movement that made my skin prickle. His eyes caught our flashlight beams and reflected them back. Like a deer, he didn't appear relieved to see us, which was the usual response when help arrived on these desolate roads. Instead, he looked calculating, as if he was trying to decide what to do with us. "No," he said. And that was that. There was something in his expression, or perhaps the lack of it, that caused me to unconsciously slow down. I had never had someone turn away help in my 3 years of stopping to rescue stranded drivers, especially when they were obviously broken down in the middle of nowhere. Just one word, flat and final, and Tom and I exchanged a short glance. The more tactful Tom tried again, saying, "Are you sure we have tools in the rig so we can look at what's happening? Maybe it's something easy." The man moved his weight a little, and I saw for the first time that his hands were too clean for someone who had been working on an engine. When I started to pay attention, his clothes appeared almost staged, like a costume of what someone believed a stranded motorist should look like. "Said no," the man repeated, his voice carrying an edge this time. He wore work boots that looked brand new out of the box. That's when I caught it movement in my peripheral vision off to the right, where the tall prairie grass grew thick along the drainage ditch, he said, placing himself to his left between us and the open hood of the car. It was only a slight shift in shadows that didn't match the pattern our emergency lights created, but my EMP training kicked in. I maintained a neutral expression while letting my hand wander toward my radio. The movement in the grass stopped as soon as I looked at it directly, but I knew what I'd seen. Someone was out there staying low moving. This was the same instinct that helped me spot patients who were barely breathing or notice when something in a scene didn't add up. Tom must have sensed my tension because he changed his posture as well, becoming more defensive and alert. We had worked together long enough to read each other without using words. The man by the car noticed our shift right away, his eyes darting between us. He knew someone was there and had likely been waiting for us to approach the car before his. But he moved. His quick glance toward the grass, where I had seen the movement, told me everything. My mind raced over our choices. The ambulance was still running behind us, doors closed but unlocked, keys in the ignition, and a person who had obviously staged a breakdown standing on a dark highway at least 30 minutes away from any police. Backup, standard procedure for a hasty departure as well, if Tom's voice remained professional, but I could hear the steel underlying. "You're sure you don't need help?" he replied slowly, already stepping backward. "We'll be on our way." The man behind the car didn't answer. Instead, he just watched us with every instinct told me to run. But running would mean turning our backs on whatever threat was out there, so we had to carefully and deliberately retreat, keeping my flashlight pointed down but ready as I matched Tom's backward step. The person in the grass had gone completely still, likely realizing we were on them. The distance between us and the ambulance felt like miles, but it was evident that we weren't easy targets without turning the situation violent. Then everything went sideways, and the person in the grass suddenly erupted, running toward us from a direction that would cut off our route to the ambulance. Tom reacted immediately, turning to face the new threat and yelling, "Move, move, move," as I caught a clear glimpse of a woman in her early 20s, dressed entirely in black, her face contorted with desperate resolve, and something in her right hand catching the light. I didn't need the encouragement. We both started running, but not in the direction of the ambulance, because that route was unsafe. Instead, we used the width of the road to keep a safe distance from each other as we ran across the highway toward the opposite shoulder. As Tom and I arrived at the far side of the highway, we both sprang over the metal guardrail and dove in without talking about it. The man by the car had also begun to move, completely abandoning his broken-down motorist act. I could hear their footsteps pounding on the asphalt behind us. Tom burst through the underbrush someplace to my left, cursing steadily, and I heard our pursuers arrive at the top of the steep embankment. The earth dropped away more sharply than anticipated, and I tumbled down the branches, tearing at my uniform pebbles and bruising my ribs. We scurried through the darkness at the bottom of the slope, using a dry creek bed as cover, while Guardrail and Stop, who were likely considering whether to follow us into the rocky terrain, hesitated, costing US valuable seconds. My radio had been knocked loose by the fall and was hanging from its cord. However, it continued to function. Tom picked it up as we were moving and called dispatch with our location and circumstances. His voice remained astonishingly composed as he reported an attempted ambush on Highway 287 and asked for rapid law enforcement assistance. The dispatcher's response was remarkable. Units were rolling, but they couldn't see us in the darkness, but they knew we were asking for help. A car door slammed, and an engine came to life. They were departing, likely thinking their window of opportunity had closed, and we remained hidden. The closest was still 25 minutes away. Above us, I could hear irate voices arguing, listening to the sedan's engine fade into the distance in that creek bed for what seemed like hours, but was really just 10 minutes. When the silence came, neither of us moved, and we eventually ascended back up to the highway. As we stood on that deserted highway, the reality of what nearly happened struck me hard. The sedan and, more disturbingly, our ambulance were gone, together with all of our supplies, drugs, and everything inside. Emergency lights were no longer painting that the police discovered our ambulance 3 hours later, abandoned at a rest stop 50 miles north, stripped of all drugs and valuable medical equipment. Despite similar incidents, they were never able to apprehend the 2 EMTs who set the trap. It was dark, and they were waiting for backup, which seemed to take forever. Reported that emergency responders, medical supply trucks, and even pharmaceutical delivery vehicles were the targets of summertime fake breakdowns in 3 states. Tom and I returned to work after a few days off, but something had changed. Previously, we had always stopped to aid without asking any questions. The thing that bothers me the most isn't the chase or the danger, but rather the knowledge that there is someone out there who actually needs help. We radioed our position to dispatch before approaching any breakdown, kept our doors closed, kept our engines running, and constantly looked for movement in the shadows. The true crime in all of this is turning compassion into caution, making us wonder if the next person with their hood up is truly in difficulty or just another trap waiting to spring. We might have to wait a little longer because predators choose to take advantage of our natural desire to help. The most stressful period of my teaching career was probably last November, when I was 26 years old and teaching algebra and geometry at Westfield High. Parent-teacher conferences kept me up late nearly every night that week, and since I lived about 40 minutes outside of town, I typically took Highway 47 to get home, which is an old lane bypass that cuts through that particular Thursday. I had been at school since 7 a.m. and by the time I finally locked up my classroom at the end of the day, I was alone with my podcasts, whatever leftovers I was planning to reheat for dinner, and nothing but cornfields and scattered farmhouses. I just wanted my sofa and maybe a glass of wine. At 9:30 p.m. the journey began normally enough, and I recall seeing the old Garrison farm with its broken windmill that moaned in the wind every time. Then the diamond-shaped construction sign blinked amber lights next to orange cones that blocked half the lane ahead of an abandoned gas station where teens allegedly went to drink on weekends, some 15 miles from home, just where the road drops down near Miller's Creek. This man in a reflective vest was standing in the center, holding one of those stop-slow paddles. I was perplexed because I hadn't heard of any road construction planned in that area. The county typically sends out notices. In addition, who does construction at nearly 10 at night? As I approached, more information began to emerge. The cones appeared strangely placed, as if someone had thrown them outside without measuring, and the construction sign, one of those temporary ones on wheels, was positioned at an odd angle. I couldn't see any actual text on it, and the cones registered in ways that made my skin prickle. Only the flashing lights, but what truly drew my eye was the man. He had on the orange vest over what appeared to be typical streetwear jeans and work boots, yes, but also a dark hoodie underneath that didn't seem appropriate for a construction worker. His hard hat was crooked, as if he had grabbed it at the last minute, and he was standing in the midst of nothing, waving that paddle for me to stop. I let off the gas and stopped about 20 feet away from him, keeping my doors locked out of habit. He started right away. There were no trucks, no equipment, and no torn up asphalt. He was approaching my car with a deliberate stride that tightened my chest rather than the weary shuffle of someone who had been directing traffic all day. His eyes were fixed on me through my windshield, and he wasn't looking at the road or looking for other cars. Under the intense glare of my headlights, I could clearly see his face. He was probably in his mid-30s, with patchy stubble and an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't neutral either. He motioned for me to roll down my window, making an exaggerated rolling motion with his hand, and I saw that he had no company ID or badge on. "Roads closed ahead, miss," he began, but his voice had this odd sound to it, as if he were reading from a script he had just learned. Got to. I cracked my window maybe 2 inches, just enough to hear what he needed, despite my instincts screaming against me. "I need to see your license and registration for the report before I can divert you back the way you came." The report that I've been through before in about genuine construction stops, and no one never asked for my documents. And as I watched him lean closer, I noticed that my hand was hovering over the gear shift. I smelled it. Cigarettes mixed with gasoline or paint thinner. His eyes kept flitting between my face and the interior of my car, as if he was cataloguing everything he could see. I answered, attempting to speak steadily as my heart pounded my ribs. "I'll just turn around." However, he moved closer, grabbing for my door handle. No, I need those documents first. State requirement." His fingers curled around the handle and pulled, and I'm glad I locked it. He yanked the handle more fiercely this time and smashed his other palm against my window, saying, "Open the door." The pretension suddenly vanished from his face as the door shook but failed to open, and he was replaced by something meaner and harder. He yelled, removing any pretense of being a road worker. I saw movement in my side mirror as another figure emerged from the shadows beyond the cones, moving in the direction of my car before my mind could catch up. As I quickly backed up, the man pushed the car into reverse, squealing the tires on the tarmac. He shouted something I couldn't hear over the sound of my engine, and I could see in my rearview mirror that a second person in similar clothing was rushing toward me. I continued to reverse, possibly at a speed of 30 miles per hour. I swerved slightly when my back wheel struck the shoulder while in reverse down that dark road. The ditch to my right was deep and black, and for a horrifying moment, I felt the car tilt as the back passenger tire dropped off the edge. I quickly adjusted by pulling the wheel to the left. Those 2 figures were still approaching, their phony fluorescent vests catching my taillights like monster eyes, and I rotated the wheel to where I had reversed maybe 100 yards. Gravel was showering as I struggled to maintain control in front of me, or behind me now that I was moving backward. On that narrow road, I forced myself to do the sloppiest 3-point turn of my life. My headlights raced across the tree line, then the empty fields, and then back to the road ahead, or what should have been behind me just a second ago. As I put it in gear and floored it, I caught one last. The person who had approached my window was now on his phone, and something about that detail scared me more than the attempted break-in. Was he calling others to warn someone up ahead? I pushed my head back when I caught a glimpse of them in my mirrors. They had given up the chase and were standing by their fictitious construction setup, watching me run. I didn't stop or slow down until I reached the main highway 10 miles later. Even then I kept checking my mirrors in the hopes of seeing headlights rushing up behind me. I drove my small Honda to 70 on that twisting road, taking corners way too quickly, my entire body shaking as adrenaline ran through me. I went into the first gas station I came across, one of those bright 24-hour establishments, and parked just beneath the lights outside the door. When I got out, my knees felt like jelly, and I had to rest against my car for a minute to get my bearings. The clerk inside must have noticed something in my face because he asked if I was okay. I told him what had happened, and he instantly allowed me to call 911 using the store phone. As I waited for the police, I saw that my hands were bloody scratches from holding onto the steering wheel so tightly and my rearview mirror had a crack that hadn't been there before. Smacked it with my hand during the escape without even recognizing it. Within 15 minutes, two county deputies arrived, and I drove them back to the location while they continued on. However, by the time we arrived, everything had vanished. There were no cones, flashing signs, or signs that anyone had been there at all. The deputies used flashlights to search the area, and one of them discovered new tire tracks in the soft shoulder where the sign had been, along with some cigarette butts that appeared to have been dropped recently. They took my statement, took pictures of the scene, and informed me that I had done the right thing by remaining motionless and not opening my door. The investigation later showed that the construction equipment had been stolen from a Department of Transportation lot. The younger deputy said they had received similar reports over the past few months: fake police checkpoints, fake accident scenes, and fake construction sites on remote roads, all at night. Around 50 miles distant 3 nights prior to my encounter, security footage showed two individuals loading signs and cones into a pickup truck. The vests were taken from the same location, along with some other equipment that made my stomach turn. The items included rope zip ties and a crowbar. My cases. Detectives said I was lucky. Another woman the month before had not been so lucky, but she had escaped after they had gotten her out of her car. She had been too traumatized to provide a detailed account, but what she remembered matched what I had seen. The men were never apprehended, despite the phony construction stops. Abruptly halted when my report was featured in the local news. I no longer take Highway 47. I know that's giving them a slight advantage, but I simply can't do it. Instead, I take the longer route through town, which now adds 20 minutes to my commute, while still passing through densely populated, well-lit areas. When I see actual road construction up ahead while driving at night, I still get that panic attack and keep my foot hovering over the brake. I look for ways out. A week after it happened, I installed a dash cam and kept pepper spray in my door pocket. The school provided counseling, which helped, but I still occasionally have dreams in which I'm backing up. The one thing that haunts me the most is thinking about their plan. What would have happened if I had been too trusting, too exhausted, or too slow to react? The detective informed me that they had likely been observing that road for weeks, learning the patterns. Waiting for the desert roads, outside Flagstaff becomes strangely quiet after midnight, especially in early October when the tourist season is coming to an end. I was 29 years old, working from home as a freelance graphic designer, and I had just spent the evening at the north side of town at my girlfriend Sarah's apartment. We had been dating for about 8 months, and I had been quite accustomed to the 40-minute trip between our homes. That evening, I left her apartment at approximately 1 in the morning. Perhaps a few minutes later, the temperature had dropped to that ideal Arizona autumn chill when you can drive with the windows cracked and yet require a jacket. I recall feeling calm and at ease even as I turned into Highway 89A heading south. Sarah lived in one of those more recent complexes close to the route I always used. Began with bustling streets close to college, and then gradually changed to darker, empty roads as you moved farther from town. I was attending university while renting a little property on the outskirts closer to the national forest. I'd driven it so many times that I could probably do it with my eyes closed. I knew every curve and dip in the asphalt. About 15 minutes in, you'd reach this stretch where the streetlights completely vanished, leaving only your headlights and the occasional pair of glowing eyes from an animal in the brush. That night began like any other late. The first 20 minutes of the journey home were quite ordinary. I noticed a cop parked at his usual speed trap area outside the Walmart, passed a few other cars exiting the bar district, and had my usual energy drink in the cup holder with an indie rock playlist playing softly through the speakers. However, as I reached that darker, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror on a section of 89A, where the road winds through the pines and narrows. At first, I thought this was normal, but they were sitting too close for comfort. The high beams were shining directly into my mirrors, making it impossible to tell what kind of car it was. I initially assumed it was just some drunk drivers. I tapped my brakes a few times, the universal signal for backing off, buddy, but nothing happened. If anything, they got closer, and I felt that familiar annoyance rising in my chest. You know how it feels when someone is driving aggressively and you just want to get home without any problems. So I accelerated a little bit, maybe 5 times the speed limit, in the hopes that they would either pass me or fall back. However, those headlights remained fixed to my bumper, precisely matching my speed. And that's when the little warning sign in the back of my mind began to sound. Very accurate about this situation. There is a Shell station about 5 miles down 89A that is open around the clock. I chose to pull in part because I needed gas anyhow, but primarily to see if this person would continue. I put on my blinkers, well in advance, giving them plenty of warning, and took the exit slowly, with the headlights following me. As I came up to the pump, my chest constricted. I watched in my side mirror as the car I could see, a black SUV, possibly a Tahoe or Suburban, rolled past the gas station entrance. For a brief moment, I felt a wave of relief, but then I realized it was all in my head. About 50 yards past the station, their brake lights flared up. They pulled into the empty lot of what had once been a tire shop. The lights were still on, and I sat there at the pump engine, idling, trying to decide what to do. The gas station was well lit, with cameras all over it, and the clerk inside looked. I went out and started pumping gas, while keeping one eye on that SUV sitting in the darkness across the road, thinking he was still awake behind the counter, safely enough. That's when I observed something that made my skin crawl. There were no license plates, not even a temporary tag in the at 1 o'clock in the morning. I finished pumping gas more quickly than ever before. I'm not usually paranoid, but every true crime podcast I've ever listened to began to flood my mind again. Nothing good ever comes from cars without license plates following you. My mouth dried up as I pulled out of the station and headed back onto 89A. Sure enough, within seconds, those headlights across the road flicked back to high beams before I had even fastened my seatbelt. I had practically thrown the nozzle back on the hook and jumped back in my car. That bright light was burning holes in my mirrors once more, but this time I could see the SUV's shape better. It was definitely a Suburban, black or dark blue, with windows tinted so darkly that I couldn't see inside, and they were riding so close to my bumper that if I had to brake suddenly, I would brake. My phone was in the cup holder, and I grabbed it with one hand while attempting to maintain my balance. On the curving road, I'm grateful for voice commands, since after what seemed like an eternity, the call connected, and I tried to speak calmly as I explained the situation to the dispatcher, provided her my position, my route, and a description of the car. She asked if I could see the driver or any other passengers, but I was unable to. She also asked if they had engaged in any hostile behavior other than tailgating, which I hadn't yet. I was devastated by the response that followed. Sir, we don't currently have any units in that area. The closest patrol car is about 30 minutes away. Is it possible to reach a populated area? The closest real civilization was still about 10 miles away. There is a strip of fast food restaurants and big box stores close to the I-40. The dispatcher remained on the line, instructing me to keep her updated, but I could hear the anxiety slipping into her voice as well. I pushed the speedometer. The interchange between here and there was nothing but pine trees, sporadic houses set back from the road, and a lot of darkness. The SUV matched me mile for mile, never reversing more than a car length. At one point, the road straightened out for nearly half a mile, and I floored it, hitting 85. My little Honda was trembling. I was up to 70 and 75, taking turns, quicker than I should have on that tight road. When we reached a section with a passing lane, the SUV abruptly swerved into the left lane if they were going to pass. At that point, I assumed they were just an aggressive driver trying to get ahead, but instead of passing, they pulled up, accompanied me and matched my speed precisely. I dared to look over, but all I saw was my own headlights reflected back at me through that dark tinted window. We drove in that manner for what seemed like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Two cars were racing down, and at 1:30 a.m. on an empty highway, they suddenly began to move into my lane. They did it slowly but deliberately, pushing me to the shoulder. I turned on my horn and wrenched the wheel right tires, screaming as I hit the rumble strip. The SUV backed off just in time. They pushed me toward the edge. I swerved, honked, and backed off just to do it again. This sick game of cat and mouse went on for another mile. The dispatcher was practically shouting through my phone speaker, asking what was going on and claiming she was trying to get to the unit was redirected. But I knew that aid wouldn't arrive in time. These individuals, whomever they were, wanted me to go off that road and likely into one of those dark pull-offs where no one would be able to see what happened next. That's when I spotted salvation. I didn't use my blinker, didn't give any warning, and at the last second, I yanked the wheel hard right and shot across two lanes. In front of me were the bright lights of a 24-hour Safeway at the first major intersection heading into town. The parking lot was huge, well lit, and most importantly, there would definitely be security cameras covering every angle, tires squealing. As I made the turn too quickly, the SUV attempted to follow, but was unable to make the sharp turn because of their heavier vehicle. I sped across the parking lot, probably at 40 miles per hour, and skidded to a stop directly in front of the store's main entrance, where all the lights were at their brightest. I sat even from 100 yards away. I could feel them observing me as I made decisions about what to do next. The SUV had managed to turn around and was now sitting at the parking lot entrance, just idling there under the streetlight. For a little while, the engine was running and watching my mirrors. The dispatcher was still on the line, so I informed her where I was and what had happened. She replied that units were now approximately 15 minutes out. My entire body was shaking with adrenaline, and I realized that I was holding the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. The SUV just sat there at the entrance, engine running like some predator determining whether its prey was worth pursuing into the light, and to stay where I was, stay in the light, and keep the doors locked. A few late-night shoppers passed my car, giving me strange looks. Those were the longest 15 minutes of my life. Probably looked crazy sitting there, breathing heavily, but I didn't care since I kept my eyes fixed on the black SUV phone and my other hand ready to shift gears. If they moved, it took me maybe 5 minutes to hear when the first siren sounded. The SUV's reverse lights turned on, and they backed up carefully before turning and vanishing into the night. They drove away peacefully, as if they had just decided not to go grocery shopping, and the police arrived with 3 cars and flashing lights. The officers were professional, but I could tell they were taking this seriously because I spent the next hour giving my statement, describing every detail I could recall about the SUV, and showing them my phone's GPS history to prove the route I'd taken. One of them mentioned they'd had similar reports recently, always late, always involving a dark SUV without license plates. At night, they took the Safeway security footage, and the Shell station promised to search for additional cameras along the route. But we all knew it was unlikely to find a black SUV without any identifying marks in a city full of similar cars. The terrifying portion occurred approximately 3 weeks later. During my lunch break, I was perusing the local news when I came across the headline, "Police arrest suspects in string of violent carjackings." The piece detailed how a group had been following victims from pubs, shops, and restaurants in a black Suburban, waiting until they reached remote roads to attack. They would box the victim's car, make them stop, and then rob them at gunpoint, sometimes far worse. The picture displayed the confiscated vehicles. 5 victims over 2 months were all attacked on quiet roads outside of town. The detective I spoke with that afternoon confirmed it was probably the same group that had followed me. and the Safeway security footage had likely saved me from I still take the long route home from Sarah's place, which stays on well-lit main roads the entire time, and I still check my mirrors more than I should, especially when I see headlights. I became victim number 6 because they were alarmed by all the cameras and decided I wasn't worth the risk. 8 years of working night shifts at the Grand View taught me to notice details most people miss, like how shadows act differently at 3 in the morning. That sits a little too close for comfort. I believed I had witnessed every type of late-night drama that could occur through those automated doors, but nothing prepared me for what transpired on that particular night. How stillness can slam into your eardrums like a warning on a chilly Wednesday morning in February 2023. The hotel wasn't the most upscale establishment in town, but it provided me with consistent work despite a stream of passengers who were insomniacs and people fleeing unidentified problems. I had previously worked double shifts to cover for my co-worker Jessica, who I called in sick because I was so tired. My lower back hurt from standing 4 hours on end, my feet hurt in those sensible black shoes, and all I wanted to do was fall into my own bed. It was 6:47 a.m. The morning air greeted me like a slap, crisp and cruel in that way. February mornings have of reminding you that winter isn't over yet. I tugged my burgundy coat tighter as I finally got my purse and made my way to the parking lot. Around my shoulders and fumbled for my car keys, already estimating in my mind how long it would take to drive the 12 miles to my apartment. Since most people were on shifts, traffic would be light at this hour, and I would be heading home while everyone else was getting ready for another day. My Honda Civic was parked beneath one of my car's heater had been acting strangely lately, blowing cold air for the first 10 minutes before warming up. So I started with flickering parking lot lights covered in a thin layer of frost that I would have to scrape off before I could see clearly through the windshield. This meant I would be shivering for the majority of the drive home. The drive began like any other morning commute, quiet streets, a few delivery trucks making early rounds, and the occasional jogger brave enough to face the cold. I turned on the engine and let it run while I worked on clearing the ice. The only sound in the empty lot was the rhythmic scraping of the plastic tool against glass. I could almost do it with my eyes closed a lot of the time. The radio played a bland pop tune that hardly registered in my exhausted head as I drove down Maple Street, left on Industrial Boulevard, past downtown, and onto the highway that would take me to my area, and I started to nod along in order to be vigilant. About halfway home, I got to the intersection of 5th and Industrial, where a traffic light always seemed to catch me, no matter what time I went by. As I got there, the light turned red, and I stopped, behind a dark blue sedan that had just pulled up. At first look, the car didn't seem particularly noteworthy. It might have been a 2018 or 2019 model. Nothing special, just another commuter attempting to get somewhere. But while I waited for the light to turn, something struck my eye. I've noticed a lot of people driving about with trunks that weren't fully closed, instead hanging open 3 or 4, producing a dark gap that seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision like a warning. This attention made my exhausted mind suddenly sharp and concentrated. This felt unusual in some way. It bounced a little with every little movement of the car, as if something inside was changing around. I moved forward in my seat and squinted through my glass to get a closer view. It might have been damaged mechanics, overloaded with groceries, or simply forgetfulness. And that's when I noticed it, a pale form that quickly materialized in that dark space before vanishing again. At first, I thought maybe they had a dog back there, but the movement seemed too intentional and human-like for an animal. Every instinct told me to pay attention to what I was seeing, but the traffic light seemed to take forever, so I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. When the light finally turned green, the sedan slowly moved forward, and I had to make a snap decision that would alter everything. Rather than making my usual right turn toward home, I followed the blue sedan, drove right through the crossroads. I had a gut feeling that this wasn't a coincidence or a trick of my mind. After a long shift, the pale object I had seen moved once more, and this time was positive. It was human fingers pressing against the sedan drove at precisely the speed limit, and there was nothing unusual about the way it handled turns or stopped at signs, which somehow made my heart pound against my ribs as I kept a careful distance behind the car, close enough to continue observing, but far enough back that the driver wouldn't see me in their mirrors, made the whole situation more eerie. The driver knew how to blend in and avoid drawing attention while transporting whatever or whoever was trapped in that trunk. I kept my eyes on the road and fumbled for my phone with one hand in an attempt to get a clear view of the license plate, but the angle was off, and the camera on my phone was having trouble focusing through the windshield. We travelled for roughly 6 blocks through a section of town I didn't often visit, past vacant parking lots and shuttered shops that appeared different in the grey morning light. The sedan turned left onto Henderson Road, a street with older warehouses and industrial buildings that had seen better days. Most of the businesses here would close for hours, leaving the area almost empty except for us and a few straggling cars. Parked along the curbs, I began to feel vulnerable, so I backed off because I was afraid the driver might see my headlights in their rearview mirror. Deeper and made an effort to commit to memory any detail I could about the car. The trunk continued to bounce a little with that, and the dark blue 4-door sedan appeared to be a Nissan Altima based on the taillights and a minor ding in the passenger side rear bumper. Same rhythmic movement, and I saw what I now believed to be a hand desperately pressing against the inside of the lid once more. My mind was racing with all sorts of possibilities, but I knew that, if I didn't act, I would be haunted by what I was seeing for the rest of my life. The sedan abruptly increased speed and made a sharp right turn into what appeared to be an abandoned industrial complex. I paused for a brief moment, watching the tail lights fade away behind a razor wire top chain link fence, and by the time I made the decision to pursue them, they had vanished. As I pulled up to the entrance, I noticed a tangle of concrete buildings, loading docks, and the car could have gone in a number of directions, and I had no way of knowing which one they had taken without going farther into the complex and running the risk of an unprepared confrontation. It would have been wise to call the police at that moment, but I sat in my idling car for what seemed like an eternity, staring at the industrial wasteland and feeling completely helpless. The morning sun was growing stronger now, casting long shadows between the buildings, and I knew that I had no concrete evidence of what I'd seen, just a partially open trunk and movement that could have been anything. My voice was shaking as I called 911 from the parking lot outside the industrial complex, trying to explain what I had seen to the dispatcher. She was professional, but I had to decide whether to drive home and try to forget what I had seen or figure out how to obtain aid for whoever might be trapped in that trunk. Evidently dubious, a hotel employee reporting suspicious activity in a car trunk wasn't exactly an urgent situation, so I provided her with the best description I could of the car, the address where it vanished, and the license plate numbers I believed I had seen, though I wasn't entirely sure about the final 2 digits. I drove home feeling sick to my stomach, knowing that I had done what I could, but wondering if it was enough. The remainder of that morning was a blur of restless sleep, filled with nightmares about pale hands pressing against dark spaces and muffled voices. The dispatcher said they would send an officer to check the area, but it might be a while before anyone arrived. Screams for assistance that no one could hear. I turned on the local news as soon as I woke up at 2 p.m, hoping to find any stories that might validate what I had seen. I was preparing for another shift at the hotel when the evening news came on, and the anchor's words struck me like a physical blow. The story that made my world tilt sideways wasn't until the following day, when the regular morning programming and weather updates were shown. The anchor was a 28-year-old woman named Angela Brooks, was abducted from a grocery store parking lot, escaped from the trunk of a car, kicked out the back seat, crawled into the car's interior, while her captor was stopped at a gas station, then leapt out and fled for assistance. Kevin Walsh, 35, was arrested by the police at the automobile. A dark blue 2018 Nissan Altima with a slight ding in the back bumper was found from his apartment. It was the same car I had followed and the same trunk I had seen bouncing with frenzied movement. Angela Brooks had been fighting for her life in that car while I was sitting there. I couldn't stop glancing at her face as I thought about how close she had come to going missing forever. The news article featured her portrait, a gorgeous brunette with gentle eyes who taught at the primary school. According to the police statement, Angela had been detained for the idea and made me physically ill. I'd been right there, I'd seen the signs, and I'd called for help, but I wondered why she had been trapped in that trunk for the majority of the night, probably terrified and losing hope that anyone would find her, for about 18 hours before she was able to escape. If I had the option, would I have followed the vehicle into that industrial complex? Should I have gotten out and confronted the driver? My logical side knew that would have been foolish and dangerous, but the guilt still tore at me. The news report stated that Walsh had a history of assault charges and had been following Angela for weeks prior to the kidnapping. He had meticulously planned it, waiting for her to leave work late one evening before snatching her in the shadowy parking lot behind the school. It both relieved and troubled me that she had escaped on her own initiative and bravery. Not because of my phone call. I was able to give the police some information after witnessing a crime in progress, but Angela Brooks had already saved her life. 3 months have gone by since that morning, and I still think about her every time I drive home from work. The police detective who called me back stated that my report had assisted them in setting up a timeline and verify the specifics of Walsh's path, which bolstered their case against him. He was given a 15-year sentence, and Angela established a foundation to support other survivors of kidnapping. There are moments when I question whether I'll ever stop reliving those brief moments at the traffic light and wondering what might have happened if I had behaved differently, or if things had turned out differently sooner. But for the most part, I've learned to trust my gut more than I ever had before. Working hotel nights exposes you to people at their most vulnerable, and I now pay even more attention to the details that don't quite fit the way someone holds themselves, the fear in their eyes. Angela Brooks showed me that sometimes being a witness is enough, and that even the tiniest act of noticing can make all the difference. I can't save everyone, but I'll never again disregard that instinct when something doesn't look right. People continually tell me that I should trust law enforcement since they are there to protect me after what happened to me, but 3 years later, I still get that awful feeling in my stomach when I see patrol cars in my rearview mirror. I'm not sure now, but at the time I was 24, working construction during the day and attending night schools for my engineering degree. Jake and I had designed this route together. Jake and I had been buddies since high school. The plan was straightforward: drive through the night, catch a Broncos game, then spend a few days hiking around Rocky Mountain National Park before returning to Minneapolis. We were traveling to Denver 4 months in his beat-up Honda Civic, packed with camping supplies and enough energy drinks to power a small city. It was around 2:30 a.m. We were halfway between Billings and the Wyoming border on a Friday, March 2022. The highway went on forever in front of us, with just darkness and the occasional semi-truck thundering by in the distance. The radio was playing a late-night talk show about alien abductions, and we were half listening and half making jokes about how we would likely be the ideal targets out here in the middle of nowhere. Jake had been driving for the last 4 hours, while I slept in the passenger seat, but the caffeine from our most recent gas station stop had me wide awake again. Jake mentioned that his speedometer had been acting strangely lately, sometimes indicating that he was going 10 miles per hour. The area around us was utterly desolate. There were no houses or businesses, only rolling hills covered in scrub brush and the kind of darkness that makes you feel like you're the only two people left on Earth. When we noticed the red and blue lights flashing behind us, Jake instantly began to slow down, checking his speed. and muttering that he had been going maybe 5 over the limit. The patrol car followed us for what seemed like an eternity, getting so close that the headlights were illuminating our whole area. We assumed it would be a brief encounter, perhaps a warning or a little citation, and then we'd be back on the road. However, when Jake eventually pulled over into the gravel shoulder, I recall experiencing the same nervousness you get during every traffic check. When I watched him approach through the side mirror on our way to Denver, the officer took his time getting out of his car, which I later discovered was a common intimidation tactic. His uniform, which was dark blue and official looking with all the appropriate patches and badges, was the first thing that caught my attention as strange. When he arrived at Jake's window, the officer leaned down with a flashlight, so bright it was nearly blinding. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but I could see sharp cheekbones and pale skin that appeared to have seen little sun. Something about the way it fit seemed strange, like perhaps it was a size too big for his frame. Jake gave over his license and registration. He was probably in his 40s, with graying hair buzzed short and eyes that seemed to reflect the flashlight beam in an unsettling way. He added in a calm voice that somehow had an edge of authority that sounded excessive for a typical traffic check. His papers without question, and I saw that the officer's badge bore the name Deputy C. Hartwell along with an unidentified county sheriff's department emblem. As he looked over Jake's license, he continued to move the flashlight beam between us, lingering on our faces for longer than seemed necessary. "Have you guys had any alcohol tonight?" he inquired, despite the fact that neither of us had consumed any alcohol since we began driving. Jake's courteous response to the question felt more like an accusation than ordinary protocol. Deputy Hartwell studied the license for an uncomfortable amount of time, occasionally looking up at Jake's face as if comparing it to the photo, without having been drinking, explaining that we were just trying to make good time to Denver. Then, instead of returning to his patrol car to run the license, he did something that instantly raised red flags in my mind. He stood there tapping it against his palm, every cop I'd ever seen, saying, "I'm going to need you both to step out of the vehicle." His tone changed to one that was more authoritative. Routine sobriety check. Jake and I exchanged a quick look, both of us realizing that this wasn't routine at all. Avoid doing sobriety tests on the side of a major highway in the middle of the night, especially if there is no sign of impairment. However, if a police officer orders you to exit your vehicle, you have no other option. As we got out, I saw that his patrol car was and the paint job appeared new, but almost anew, as if it had just been repainted to match official vehicles. Actually, Deputy Hartwell said, as we stood on the gravel shoulder, semi-trucks thundering by and causing wind gusts that almost knocked us off. The older model was the Crown Victoria, the type that most departments had phased out years ago, balancing "there's too much traffic and noise here for field sobriety testing." He pointed to a dirt road that split off 50 yards ahead, scarcely visible in the dark. "I'll need you to follow me down that side road to a more controlled area." Every instinct in my body told me that this was incorrect. Police officers never move traffic stops to secondary sites unless they have a very good cause for doing so, and they never do so without radioing in their location or calling for backup. Raised concerns about his process, but Jake was already nodding and saying that we would follow him. The deputy returned to his car with a gait that didn't seem appropriate for someone carrying out official police work, and I saw his profile in his headlights. There was something about his jawline and his demeanor that reminded me of Jake was holding on to the Honda as he led us down the narrow dirt road, which was barely wide enough for one vehicle, with deep ditches on either side and overgrown brush that scraped against our windows. It looked like someone trying too hard to look authoritative, like an actor playing a role he hadn't quite mastered. We got back in the Honda and followed his taillights, the steering wheel tighter than usual, and I could tell he was beginning to have the same doubts I was. "This doesn't feel right, man," he finally said, expressing what we were both thinking. The road appeared to wind deeper and deeper into the desert, and the deputy's car kicked up dust clouds that made it difficult to see. After around 10 minutes of driving, we arrived in a small clearing encircled by towering trees and cut off from the highway. The deputy parked his vehicle at an angle that prevented us from taking the most direct path back to the main road, and when he got out, this with his hand resting on his service weapon, he approached our car in a non-threatening manner, but made it obvious that he wanted us to notice it. "Both of you out now," he barked, and this time there was a change in his entire demeanor. The professional facade had vanished, replaced by something that made my skin crawl. Deputy Hartwell positioned himself so that Jake and I could hear the sound of the wind through the trees and our own quick breathing. But as soon as we got out of the car again, I realized that we were entirely cut off from civilization, he said. "Turn around, hands on the hood." And when we hesitated for a moment, his voice became sharp and angry. I said, "Turn around," and we did, placing our palms on the cold metal of Jake's Honda. The deputy moved behind us, and I could hear him moving. That way, his body was between us and our car, effectively trapping us in the clearing around, but instead of the usual sounds of a field sobriety test or pat down, there were metallic clicks, rustling fabric, and other sounds that weren't appropriate for a normal traffic stop. The entire situation had gone from being uncomfortable to truly frightening, and I felt we were in serious trouble. Rather than administering any sort of sobriety test, we were left alone with him in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help. This was not a police officer performing their duties. It was something completely unsafe. What occurred next still gives me nightmares. Deputy Hartwell started asking us bizarre personal questions, where we worked, if anyone knew our exact route. When we were expected to arrive in Denver, his voice had taken on an almost conversational tone, but underneath it was something predatory. He was gathering information for reasons that had nothing to do with law enforcement. I could hear Jake pacing behind us, his boots crunching on the gravel, and at one point I swear I heard him talking to himself in a low mumble that I couldn't quite make out the beam. But the deputy shouted for him to keep his eyes forward and his hands visible as soon as he tried to turn around to face him. His flashlight continued to move erratically, sometimes focusing on our backs and other times illuminating the trees around us, creating a confusing light show that made everything seem surreal. He then began discussing how many people go missing on this section of highway each year, and how simple it would be for someone to just disappear without a trace. The way he spoke sounded more like a threat than a casual conversation. I was attempting to determine whether we could flee when I heard a car approaching on the dirt road. At first, it was only a distant rumble, but it was definitely getting. The headlights came through the trees, bouncing and swaying, as whatever vehicle was navigated the rough road toward our clearing. Deputy Hartwell heard it too, because he instantly stopped pacing and became silent. Hartwell's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The self-assured, menacing persona disappeared and was replaced by "Stay exactly where you are," he growled at us in what appeared to be a panic attack, but his voice was now taut with worrying rather than authority. The approaching car turned out to be a huge pickup truck, most likely a Ford F350, with a light bar on the roof that illuminated the entire clearing like daylight. As it entered the open area, I could see that the driver was a middle-aged man, wearing a flannel shirt who appeared to be a local farmer or rancher. He rolled down his window and called out in a kind but inquisitive manner, asking if anyone needed assistance and if everything was okay. I could see Deputy Hartwell trying to gather himself as he approached the driver of the pickup truck, straightening his uniform and speaking in an official tone. "Everything's under control here, sir," he said. But even from where Jake and I were standing, I could hear the strain in his voice. Just conducting a regular traffic stop. The rancher, whose name I later found out was Bill Crawford, wasn't buying it. He had spent his entire life in this area and was aware that lawful traffic stops don't occur. In the middle of the night, down unmarked dirt roads, Bill inquired, "Which department are you with, deputy?" And I could hear the doubt in his voice. I remember most of the boys from the sheriff's office, but I don't recall Hartwell began stuttering that he was new to the region and had been transferred from another county, but his narrative was unraveling under even the most basic of interrogation. Bill kept asking him for specifics, including which county he had transferred from, who his supervisor was, and why he had arranged a traffic stop to such a remote area, that Hartwell grew increasingly defensive and upset with each question. The encounter between Bill and the phony deputy provided Jake and I with the opportunity we had been hoping for, and while Hartwell was preoccupied with keeping up his cover narrative, we were able to catch each other's attention and convey verbally that we needed to approach Bill's truck. We began to slowly back away from our car, making small, deliberate movements to avoid drawing Hartwell's attention. Bill appeared to understand what was happening because he continued to converse with the deputy and ask more specific questions. Deputy Bill stated, with the cool authority that comes from years of dealing with people trying to pull one over on you, that I'm going to need to see some proper identification from your badge number radio call sign. This is in reference to queries regarding proper process and jurisdiction. Supervisor contact details. At that point, Hartwell lost it. He whirled around to face Jake and me, his hand reaching for his pistol. But Bill was prepared for that as well. It appears that the rancher had phoned 911 during our conversation, since we could hear sirens in the distance. Deputy Hartwell, or whomever he truly was, looked around. The sound seemed to disrupt whatever enchantment had been keeping us in that area, and Hartwell's fake authority fell apart utterly. It was like watching someone's entire identity dissolve in real time. His eyes darted frantically between Bill's truck and the dirt road leading back to the highway as the sirens grew louder. For a brief moment, I believed he might try to brazenly out his impersonation until the real cops arrived. But something in his expression told me he knew the game was over. The Crown Victoria's engine coughed a rough cough, and he threw it into reverse, backing up so quickly that he almost clipped the side of Bill's pickup truck as he spun the car. Without another word, he ran toward his patrol car, fumbling with his keys in a way that destroyed any last vestige of professional competence. His headlights swept across us one last time as he turned and went toward what must have been another exit from the clearing that we hadn't noticed in the darkness. In that fleeting moment of light, I was able to see his face clearly through the windshield, and what I saw was not rage or frustration, but sheer terror. He was more terrified of being apprehended more quickly than we had been of him, which in some ways made the entire situation even more terrifying. About 5 minutes later, the actual sheriff's deputies showed up to patrol cars with official markings and officers who actually followed protocol. They promptly separated Jake, Bill, and me to obtain our as we were providing our statements. Sergeant Patricia Monroe, the lead investigator, clarified that posing as a law enforcement official is illegal, particularly when it is done to threaten and isolate civilians. It was evident from their inquiries that they took the matter very seriously. They discovered a number of items that Hartwell had reportedly dropped in his hurry to get away, including a police radio that turned out to be a children's toy and a realistic-looking but entirely fake badge. Other officers were searching the clearing for evidence, tire tracks, footprints, or anything else that might help identify our fake deputy. Altered to appear real, and most unsettling of all, a roll of zip ties and a length of rope. As each piece of evidence was bagged, Sergeant Monroe's face darkened, and she made it clear that we had been in grave danger. The items indicated that the investigation that followed showed how intricate and horrifying this entire operation had been. Hartwell, if that was even his real name, had intended to do more than just threaten us. The Crown Victoria was a decommissioned police vehicle that had been bought at auction and unlawfully altered to look. The investigators were particularly troubled by the fact that this wasn't an impromptu crime. The uniform badge and other accessories were excellent copies that would have fooled most individuals, especially in low light. Spent a lot of time and money developing a plausible law enforcement image that implied they had previously done this. However, despite a multi-state notice and a thorough search of the area, they were unable to locate Hartwell or his fictitious police car. The license plates were 3 weeks after our experience. A similar occurrence was reported in Idaho, but by the time authorities arrived, the phony cop had disappeared once more. The Crown Victoria's VIN had been carefully changed after it had been stolen from a car in another state. The FBI eventually took over the case, categorizing it as part of a pattern of crimes involving law enforcement impersonation. But as far as I'm aware, they never apprehended the man. Thinking back on that evening, I see how close Jake and I were to becoming statistics if Bill Crawford hadn't been driving down that dirt road at that time. I don't want to consider how that night might have turned out if Hartwell hadn't called for actual backup. The entire incident altered my perspective on dealings with law enforcement, not because I don't trust honest officers, but rather because I realized how simple it can be for someone with bad intentions to plans to abuse that trust. So I've since looked into what people can do if they think a fake police officer is stopping them. Some of the things I've learned include asking to see identification, asking the officer to call for backup, or driving to a well-lit public area before stopping. Learned that legitimate police officers should never refuse reasonable demands for identification verification, separate you from witnesses, or transfer you to a secondary place without a valid reason. Jake and I finally arrived in Denver around 12 hours later than anticipated, but we were unharmed and alive. I occasionally still wonder what happened to those who weren't as fortunate as we were and didn't have Bill Crawford arrive at the perfect time. That phony deputy is most likely still out there somewhere, and that thought keeps me occasionally looking in my rearview mirror, more cautiously than I used to. I know this sounds completely crazy, but I need to get this off my chest because it has been bothering me for weeks. I'm a sophomore psychology student at State University, and I've until that night in late September 2021. Life was fairly typical and predictable. I've always been the logical kind who doesn't believe in ghost stories or paranormal foolishness. I live in a tiny apartment about 20 minutes from university and work part-time at the campus library to help pay my rent. We had been studying for our abnormal psychology midterm by going over case studies until our eyes burned from staring at textbooks for 6 hours straight. I had just finished a study session at my friend Claire's house. She lives in this old farmhouse that her grandmother left her about 15 miles outside of town. Made us some coffee at around 9:00 p.m, but by 11 p.m, I was fatigued and decided to go home. Claire had advised me against returning to town via Route 47 because there had been construction that week, but I was too tired and wanted to get home as soon as possible, so I chose to cut through Blackwood Road, a narrow dirt path that winds through about 8 miles of dense forest, rather than taking the main highway that circles the countryside. I had driven it a few times during the day, and it usually cut the trip time by about 15 minutes. The road is barely wide enough. It's actually rather lovely during the day, but at night it feels like a tunnel for 2 cars to pass, with dense pine and oak trees pressing in like walls on both sides. My car is an old Toyota Corolla that my dad got me when I first started college. It's dependable, but clearly showing its age, with over about 4 miles into the woods, at the point where the road bends around this enormous fallen log that has been there 4 years. My car began making this strange noise. It has 150,000 meters on it, and the headlights aren't the best, so the surrounding forest was just a wall of unbreakable darkness punctuated only by the occasional reflective road marker. Sputtering noise, the headlights illuminated perhaps 30 feet ahead, revealing the gravel road disappearing into the trees, and this rusty gate that I could feel the entire vehicle losing power. I was able to coast to a stop next to this old barbed wire fence that runs along the edge of someone's abandoned property. It was dangling on broken hinges, and I tried turning the key a couple of times, but the engine just made this grinding noise and wouldn't start. The ensuing silence was so intense that it hurt my ears. There were no cars, no wind, and not even crickets. My phone was showing 0 bars of service, and I remember thinking how I was foolish for taking this shortcut, especially at this late hour when no one else would be passing through. That's when I saw him just 25 feet ahead, at the very edge of my headlight beam, and slightly to the right. At first, I thought maybe it was only a shadow or an oddly shaped branch, but the silhouette was definitely human, tall, dressed in what appeared to be dark clothing, and quite still. I squinted through the windshield to get a better view, but the figure was exactly where my headlights began to go out into the night. I twice honked my horn in the hopes that someone may be able to assist me or at least direct me to a residence with a landline, but the figure didn't move, didn't wave, and didn't even change position. The more I watched, the more uneasy I became. Something about the way he was standing perfectly still facing my direction made my skin crawl. I decided to try my phone again, putting it up toward the window and moving it around, desperately hoping to catch even 1 bar of signal. When I looked back up from my phone, the man was a little bit closer, maybe 5 feet than before. I hadn't heard any footsteps or the rustle of leaves. He had just moved while I was preoccupied. Now that I could see more details, he appeared to be a fairly large man, perhaps over 6 feet tall, wearing what appeared to be a dark jacket or coat. His face was still obscured by the shadows, but I could tell he was staring directly at me. I tried the horn, because I got the strange chill you get when you realize someone has been watching you without your knowledge. This time, I gave him 3 long blasts, but he didn't react. Instead, he continued to remain in the same strangely still position. I began desperately trying to restart the car by repeatedly turning the key and pounding the gas pedal. Would turn but failed to stop, producing these terrible grinding sounds that reverberated throughout the deserted forest. After attempting to start the car for approximately 5 minutes, I looked up once more and almost jumped out of my skin. The man was now only 15 feet away, directly in the center of my headlight beam. Could clearly see him now. He was enormous, probably 6'4" or taller, and he was wearing a long, dark coat that hung past his knees. What really frightened me, though, was that I was still unable to see his face. It wasn't just shadows anymore. It seemed as though there was nothing there but darkness where his face should have been. I discovered that I had been holding my breath and gasping for air, my heart thumping so loudly I could hear it in my ears, at this strange position, somewhat sideways, but with his head turned toward me and his arms hanging at his sides in this incredibly strange way. Every instinct in my body was telling me that something was seriously wrong, so I tried a different strategy and rolled down my window to say, "Hey," as my brain tried to come up with explanations. Perhaps he was wearing a ski mask, or perhaps the light was bouncing off my eyes. "Can you help me?" My car broke down, and my voice sounded more shakier than I meant it to. The words appeared to be lost in the silence, and the man didn't answer at all. He just kept. I waited for what seemed like an eternity, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and then I tried again. "Hello, are you okay?" But there was nothing, not even a nod or a gesture. It was as if he couldn't hear me, or worse, as if he was choosing to ignore me entirely. I tried my phone again, rolling the window back up, holding it against the windshield, against the side windows, and even on the dashboard, but nothing came up. The screen indicated that there were only emergency calls and messages, but even that wasn't working in this dead zone, so I began mentally weighing my options. I could try walking back the way I came. I could wait until dawn and hope someone would drive by, but that would require traveling for miles through a pitch-black forest. I made the mistake of turning my head away to check the time on my dashboard clock, which showed that it was 11:47 p.m. when I looked back up at the road. The man had simply disappeared. I checked the entire area with my headlights, the sides of the road, and even behind the fence posts, but I couldn't see him anywhere. For a brief moment, I felt a surge of comfort, thinking perhaps he had simply the forest floor is covered in fallen branches and dried leaves, so it's impossible for someone that size to have left the light beam lit quickly without me hearing anything. I sat there for a while after realizing how impossible it was for him to have found his way back to wherever he was going. After a few minutes of trying to comprehend what had happened, I decided to give the car another try. I turned the key, and, to my amazement, the engine turned over and began purring as if nothing had ever been wrong. I didn't question it. Instead, I just put it in drive and began traveling as quickly as I dared on that small dirt road. I was most likely the headlights swept back and forth as I negotiated the curbs, illuminating the thick wall of trees on either side. I kept checking my rearview mirror obsessively, half expecting to see that dark figure appear behind me, but I was traveling at about 40 miles per hour, which was way too fast for that type of road, and I just wanted to get out of there. Nothing was visible, except the red glow of my tail lights fading into the night. After a mile or so, I began to feel a little more at ease. Perhaps it had just been a confused individual, perhaps someone who was intoxicated or under the influence of drugs, and they were lost. People frequently make foolish mistakes, don't they? I was almost certain that I had overreacted when I looked in the rearview mirror once more and noticed movement. It wasn't the man, but rather a shape darker than the surrounding darkness that was traveling parallel to the road between the trees, following my car as it weaved between the trunks. My foot automatically pushed harder on the gas pedal as I ran alongside him. The shape in the mirror grew larger, and I became increasingly horrified to see that whatever was behind me was closing in on me. I drove the car up to 50 and then 55, navigating the turns at dangerous speeds that caused my tires screech against the gravel, but regardless of how quickly I moved, that dark mass continued to move through the woodland with an odd fluidity that made my stomach turn. It wasn't moving like a human or even an animal, but rather like a liquid shadow that was poured between the trees. The worst part was that I couldn't identify it. Every time I tried to focus on it in the mirror, it, overly cautious, or perhaps those guys actually needed assistance and were just the next big town, was still about 60 miles away, and I was hoping to see some lights and possibly another car or two, so I turned up the radio to distract myself with some late night DJ playing Leonard Skinner and tried to concentrate on the road ahead. I was frustrated by my lack of trust, but every gut feeling told me I had made the right decision. When I saw something in my rearview mirror that made my chest clench, I thought it was probably just a trucker having fun, but as the lights drew closer, I saw it was a smaller vehicle. A pair of headlights had appeared in the distance, traveling quickly and gaining ground rapidly. Vehicle that was unquestionably not an 18-wheeler. The car behind me was gaining ground at a pace of around 90 miles per hour, which is much quicker than anyone should be traveling on that section of highway at night. As it approached, I could see the outline of a tiny. When I saw that the car looked just like the hatchback I had passed a few minutes ago, my stomach turned over. The headlights were getting wider in my mirror, and the driver wasn't slowing down or shifting to the left lane to pass. Instead, they were approaching. I could see the outline of their front bumper in my mirror as they approached me from right behind. They abruptly swerved into the left lane when they were about 20 feet from my rear bumper, and as they pulled alongside my truck, I could see clearly through their passenger window that it was the same two men from the breakdown scene, and they were staring at me with faces that made my skin crawl. The tall guy behind the wheel had this crazy expression on his face, and the shorter passenger was pointing at me and talking to his driver. They remained next to me for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. I was just staring at my speed when the driver abruptly jerked the wheel to the right, attempting to push me off the road. I had to swerve onto the shoulder to escape getting sideswiped, with dust shooting up behind me and gravel crunching beneath my tires. The hatchback had pulled ahead for about 50 yards, but instead of continuing down the highway as most people would, they hit their brakes and began slowing down, clearly waiting for me to catch up, so they could try something else. That's when I knew for sure that the truck had fishtailed a little before I regained control and merged back onto the asphalt. These were dangerous individuals who had been using the fictitious breakdown as a ruse to get someone to stop, not stranded drivers, who were upset with me for not helping them. The realization hit me like a kick in the gut, and I trembled as I reached for my phone. If I had pulled over to help them, I probably wouldn't be driving home right now. Fingers and called 911. The operator answered on the second ring, and even though it was late, her voice was composed and professional. I tried to maintain my composure as I described the situation, telling her about the phony breakdown, the violent pursuit, and that she tried to pull me off the road. So I rattled off the mile marker I had just passed and explained that I was traveling north on Route 93, roughly 30 miles south of Kingman. The hatchback in front of me was still playing games, accelerating and decelerating. The operator asked me to describe the car and its occupants as thoroughly as I could, while keeping one eye on the road and one on the car in front of me. I did so while weaving between lanes, as if they were attempting to decide what to do next. She instructed me to stay on the line and keep her informed of what was taking place, and that she was sending units to intercept. The closest patrol car was around 15 minutes away, but she assured me that they were on their way with lights and sirens. For the next few minutes, the men in the hatchback played a perverse game of cat and mouse on the deserted highway. Every time I attempted to pass them in the left lane, they would block me precisely matching my position and speed. They would accelerate to around 80 miles per hour, putting distance between us, then abruptly brake and swerve back and forth across both lanes, causing me to slow down and stay behind them. The 911 operator remained on the line the entire time, taking notes as I gave a running commentary of their actions. At one point, they performed a pretty risky maneuver. When I tried to retain distance and fell back, they would slow down to 40 miles per hour, obviously trying to get me stuck in their little game. The operator informed me that she was updating the responding officers with our current location and that help was approaching, but I could hear the tension in her voice as well. They were slamming their brakes in front of me so hard that I had to hit my own brakes and swerve partially onto the shoulder again to avoid rear-ending them. Be composed and professional. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, I noticed blue and red lights flashing in the distance in front of us. The patrol car was approaching from the other direction, and I saw it cross the median and collide with the hatchback behind it. The situation entirely altered when those police lights were visible. The two males who had been suddenly turned into model citizens after frightening me for the last 20 minutes, stopping to the right shoulder and placing warning lights as though they were experiencing actual vehicle issues, but it was too late. The 911 operator had already provided the authorities with a detailed account of their car and their actions, along with my location updates, had produced a clear in my rearview mirror. I observed the path of their reckless driving as the patrol car approached from behind them with lights were blinking, and a second police unit came to help a few minutes later. The operator instructed me to stop at around a 4 mile ahead and bide my time till an officer collected my statement. I sat in I saw the two individuals being handcuffed and put in separate patrols with the truck's engine running and its emergency lights on. Vehicles later, when I gave my story, the officer informed me that both males were armed with knives, and only 3 hours prior, their car had been reported stolen from a Henderson petrol station. Claimed that I was fortunate to have followed my gut and not stopped to assist them.